Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Catel and welcome to another episode of Basic Nigerian History. Okay, and guys, if you don't know by now, patreon.com/Creative is where you can go to support us, join our Patreon community, become an exclusive member, all of that. So, please guys, make sure you go there and check it out and help us out. Now, last episode, we spoke about the bites of Benin and Biafra. This episode, we're going to revisit the people that we previously mentioned all over the area that eventually became Nigeria and discuss how they adapted to the new transatlantic slavery era. Let's begin. As we previously mentioned, the transatlantic slavery era truly began in the 16th century, 1526 to be exact, but it truly became a massive thing from around the 1700s, which is the 18th century. This is why we'll focus mainly on what the various peoples of Nigeria were doing during that time. So let's start with Kanem-Borno. What we know about the Kanem-Borno around this time is that during the 17th century, they were a major power in the region. However, in the 18th century, another more powerful drought struck the lands of the empire, and Kanem-Borno were affected by several long-lasting famines during around 1700 to 1750. Also, the Fulani were able to infiltrate quite deeply into the Borno territory around this time. As for the Hausa Kingdoms, during the 18th century, there were large presence of Europeans at the coast of West Africa, which meant that the trans-Saharan trade was on a decline. This, among other factors, led to an increase in constant warring and fighting between the Hausa nations. And as they continued hostilities amongst each other, Islamic religious wars were taking place in the Senegal-Gambia area in around 1727-1728 and in the Guinea area in around 1770. The Hausa nations were already familiar with Islam due to their long-time trade on the Trans-Saharan trade route, and many of the nobility identified as Muslims already. However, a new Islamic movement was now taking the nations by storm and growing stronger in the Hausa lands. Little did they know that losing the Trans-Saharan trade route was the least of their problems. In the 1770s, Usman Dan Fodio, one of the many Fulani Islamic scholars and one of the leaders of the Islamic movement, was teaching in Gobert. At the time, he was also lobbying heavily to transform the system from within. By 1785, he had successfully lobbied the Sultan of Gobert to make certain reforms and changes, including overturning excessive taxes on the people. The ruling elite of Gobert saw his growing popularity as a threat. They were like, this Usman Dan Fodio guy, we need to put him to bed. We can't let him keep doing what he's doing. In 1801, Sultan Bunu tried to combat Dan Fodio and reduce the size of his movement by introducing new laws. For example, he said only those subjects of Gobert whose fathers were Muslim could claim to be a Muslim. He also banned men from wearing turbans and women from wearing veils. However, he died 2 years later. Mysterious. In 1803, Dan Fodio helped one of his ex-students, Yunfa, to become Sultan. Now, when Yunfa became Sultan, Dan Fodio expected him to adopt many of his reforms, but soon Yunfa came to see him as a threat to his power. He began to restrict Dan Fodio's activities and even tried to kill him. Dan Fodio's community were angered by this and they attempted to leave Gobert. One particular group settled in Kebbi, and this pissed off Yunfa for some reason. Out of anger, he sent soldiers to forcefully bring them back, killing many of them in the progress and destroying the town that they were settled in. Yunfa then threatened Dan Fodio with the same treatment if he didn't leave Gobert. On February 21st, 1804, Dan Fodio obliged and went into exile to Gudu. He called his move a hijra after the prophet's flight, and a lot of people followed him. The people that followed him was a mixture of those who believed in Dan Fodio's message of Islamic reforms, as well as the average citizen of Gobert who was simply fed up with what they saw as an oppressive misgovernance. In the same year, Yunfa declared war on Usman Dan Fodio, and in return, Dan Fodio declared his own holy war against Yunfa. We're going to stop there and move on to Kororofa. We're going to come back to Yunfa and their battle when we get to the colonial times. As for Kororofa, what was Kororofa during the transatlantic slavery era? Well, by the beginning of the 18th century, Kororofa had already collapsed. Other drunken states started to rise to replace it, but none of them was as big or as strong as Kororofa. And soon, they were reduced to a small state that paid tributes to Borno, so they didn't really do much during that era. The Nupe people, what were they doing? Well, the Nupe lands were becoming even more and more powerful and extending its raids to the north and the east. What we know is that in 1770, King Jibiri reigned around this time, and he was the first Nupe king to become Muslim. Now, moving on to the Oyo Empire, the Yoruba people. Everybody was correcting me, saying that it's not Ododuwa, it's Oduduwa. I'm sorry, it's Oduduwa. I've taken my correction. Can we move on? Okay. In the 18th century, 18th century was the peak of Oyo's power. They fully embraced the slave trade, and by this time, they had already begun trading slaves for guns. Dahomey then attempted to restrict Oyo from trade, which obviously led to the warring between the Oyo and the Dahomey people that I spoke about last episode. However, even though things seemed to be going well for the empire on the external side, they were soon about to have their own internal strife, just like the Hausa Kingdoms had their own internal strifes. As Oyo won huge battles against their rivals like the Ashanti army in modern-day Ghana, which happened around 1764, it also battled with internal problems, such as what to do with its large army now that there was less need to conquer and more focus on trade. To make matters worse, in 1754, Basharun Gaa, the leader of the Oyomesi, began his quest for absolute power. And in case you don't remember, the Oyomesi were a check on the power of the emperor, the Alaafin. So the leader of the Oyomesi was like a prime minister. As Oyo was trying to adapt to his new situation, Basharun Gaa was busy orchestrating the suicides of various Alaafins so that he can keep power. He secured the suicides of Alaafin Labisi and Awonbiyanju. He then forced the next Alaafin, whose name was Agboluaje. I don't know how to pronounce that one. Anyways, he forced that guy to accede to his authority in everything, which eventually led to the poor guy committing suicide. Gaa was also suspected of poisoning and causing the death of the fourth Alaafin, Majeogbe, all in the name of retaining power over the court and the empire. Eventually, in 1774, after forcing the deaths of 4 successive Alaafins, he was executed by Alaafin Abiodun, but by this time, the long period of instability had started weakening the empire. Luckily, the wide distribution of administrative activities among many respected slaves like the Ilari and so on kept the empire running. Also, the political tension between the Alaafin and the Oyomesi weren't resolved just because Basharun Gaa had not been killed. And the office of the Alaafin was never as strong as it was back in the 16th and 17th century. Things started to go bad for the Oyo Empire. In 1783, Oyo, under the rule of Abiodun, carried out a failed campaign against Bogu. In 1789, they carried out another failed campaign against the Nupe people. Eventually, Alaafin Abiodun was murdered by his own son, Awole, who took power and went on to create even more instability. In 1793, Awole, for one reason or the other, commanded the supreme military leader of the Oyo armies, whose name was Afonja, to attack his father's maternal home. In Yoruba, the supreme military leader is called the Are Ona Kakanfo, and Afonja refused this mission because to him it was taboo to do such a thing. He was bound by oath not to do such a thing, lest the spirit of the deceased Alaafin torment him and cause him a miserable death. Afonja, who was at the time also the ruler of Ilorin, a province southeast of Oyo-Ile, decided that Awole had to go. He didn't believe in Awole's administrative abilities, and to be honest, he wanted the position of Alaafin for himself. So he conspired with the Oyomesi to come up with a plan that would take down Awole. In 1796, Awole commanded Afonja to attack a market town in Ife. This was also an unusual order, as Ile-Ife was considered the spiritual lands of the Yoruba, and all Alaafin were bound under oath never to attack the place. However, this seemed to be the opening Afonja was waiting for. He did as Awole requested, but then afterwards, he marched on Oyo-Ile capital to demand Awole's abdication. He demanded Awole abdicate the throne for breaking his oath. Awole was then forced to commit suicide, leaving the throne empty. Afonja then expected himself to be named the next Alaafin because of the role he played in deposing Awole, but the Oyomesi chose a different prince for Alaafin, and this angered him incredibly. He returned to Ilorin and declared his independence from Oyo. Having so many of the Oyo armies under his control, he then proceeded to mount an all-out offensive against Oyo-Ile and other nearby provinces. In 1796, the Egba people took advantage of all this unrest in the heart of the empire to kill the Ilari that was watching over them and shake off Oyo rule. This was to be one of many outlying provinces that Oyo would eventually lose. Next, we talk about the Nimi people. The Nimi people did not take part in the slave trade. Their land was a sanctuary for slaves. but this meant they couldn't compete with other slave trading economies. Between the 16th to the 17th century, there was a decline in the Nigerian Kingdom as more and more Igbo communities took up the slave trade. They didn't let the native religion stop them from economic opportunities in the slave trade. This reduced Nui's influence, and Aro and its oracle who became even more powerful. Nui dominance declined after the beginning of the 18th century, but it survived in a weak form all the way up until 1911, when the British troops forced the reigning Eze Nui to renounce all ritual power of the religion known as the Ikenga, ending the Kingdom of Nui as a political power. The Benin people. During the Transatlantic slavery era, the Benin Kingdoms were involved with the Europeans from the very beginning because they were situated so close to the coast. During the early 16th century, the Oba of Benin sent an ambassador to Lisbon, and in exchange, Portugal sent Christian missionaries to the Benin Kingdom. Some residents of Benin could still speak broken Portuguese until the late 19th century. However, the Kingdom of Benin was always wary of their new partners in the Europeans and began to look for ways to protect themselves. In 1550, the Oba of Benin steadily started refusing the sale of male slaves, forcing the Europeans to look elsewhere. By 1553, the English made contact with Benin and started trading with Benin based on the exports of ivory, palm oil, peppers, and some slaves, although Benin tried to limit the sale of slaves as much as possible. Even though Benin had a well-organized and powerful military, it would still sometimes recruit European mercenaries to help with wars against other nations in exchange for trade items. At some points during the 18th century, they even tried to organize a guild of blacksmiths that would manufacture light firearms to further improve their military, but dependence on imports was still too heavy. Between 1603 to 1604, there is a record that European cannons helped batter and destroy gates of a town near present-day Lagos, allowing 10,000 Benin warriors to enter and conquer it. The Europeans quickly gained respect for the Kingdom of Benin due to their well-disciplined military, their amazingly built cities, and their hard bargaining stance. And as we're talking about the Benin Kingdom, we might as well quickly mention the Warri Kingdom, which was even further down and closer to the coast. The Warri Kingdom was founded by a prince of Benin in around 1480 and was one of Benin's vassals. During the 15th century, it was visited by Portuguese missionaries, and at the beginning of the 17th century, the son of the reigning Olu of Warri was sent to Portugal and he returned with a Portuguese wife. During the 1640s, their son, Antonio Domingo, became Olu of Warri. As for during the Transatlantic slavery era, the area of the Warri Kingdom completely put itself in the hands of the Europeans. From around 1720 to 1800, Olu Eredua expanded Warri politically and commercially and used the Portuguese to help Warri with further independence from Benin and establish control over a larger area. Warri served as a base for Portuguese and Dutch slave traders. It would later go on to become a port city in the late 19th century and a HQ for the British in the early 20th century. And that's it for this episode. In conclusion, by 1800, many states in the Nigerian region, with the notable exception of Benin, were heavily dependent on slavery and the slave trade for their political stability and economic wealth. However, states further up north, such as the Kanem-Borno and the Hausa Kingdoms, were facing more pressing internal issues, either due to infighting or famine and droughts. Next episode, we are going to speak about British activity during the transatlantic slavery era, as well as activity of people from the Nigerian diaspora. Thank you.